Great. I think we're starting to get some people join us. So thank you for joining our first webinar. Great. So I'm going to jump straight in. I know it's 1:31, so we're going to waste no time and get into it because we've got some great minds here that we're really keen to hear from. So I'm Emily Curlewis, stepping in CEO. Okay, I might just get you to go on mute. I think you're getting a bit of background noise from you. That's okay. Perfect. Thanks, Kate. Emily Curlewis. I look after government relations and marketing here at Zepto. Crystal, unfortunately, has had to step out for today, so I'm back up MC. So hopefully I do an okay job, but no judgment. But thank you for joining us. I'm based in Canberra, so I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of ACT, where I am based, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples joining us today. I really want to say thank you to everyone for joining our first Zepto Connect webinar event. We are really hopeful that we're going to have more of these over the coming weeks, months, and years, hopefully. And really what the Zepto Connect webinar series is all about is bringing together in a virtual setting some really compelling conversations about all the things we love and here at Zepto and what we're really passionate about. Technology, people, brilliant businesses, innovation, pioneers, all those types of things. We're going to create conversations and bring together some brilliant minds and point of views and share that with our community. So really grateful for everyone joining us today for the first one. And what a way to start. We've got some great Australian minds here in the virtual room with us today. So really thankful also to our speakers for joining us. Today's topic is what's next for Australian tech. So a nice broad topic for us to kick off with, but an exciting one nonetheless, because we're really passionate to be part of Australia's thriving tech community. Our speakers today, these great minds that we have joining us, we've got Kate Pounder, who's the CEO of the Tech Council of Australia. Zepto's been a proud member of the TCA since its early days, and we're really amazed by how much of an impact they've had representing the tech community and to government. We're also joined by Damian Kassabgi, who has a great career in policy across both government and tech and worked at organisations like Uber and Afterpay. He's also based up in Byron Bay, where Zepto is headquartered. So we're lucky to tap into his brilliant mind quite frequently. And then also Dom Pym. So Dom's a great entrepreneur, investor, and technologist who founded Up, a digital bank. And I actually was really excited the first time I saw an Up card in the wild. I remember when someone tapped an Up card at a cafe, I gave out a little scream. So I think it's really exciting to see some of these businesses come to life. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to dive right in and start with you, Kate. In your position at the Tech Council, you obviously have visibility of the entire Australian tech sector. And you've done some research into this space as well. I'm really keen to hear from you, like what areas of tech are we seeing real growth and innovation currently?
Thank you, Em, and thank you to Zepto for organising this webinar. What a great series. And a delight to be here with the other panellists. We got McKinsey to do a report for the Tech Council last year, which asked what is Australia great at when it comes to the tech sector? And the reason we did it, and Damian's going to be nodding along when I say this, if I walked in the Parliament House and asked a politician to tell me what we're great at when it comes to agriculture, what we're great at when it comes to mining, they would just like reel off companies, reel off, areas of those industries. But I think often when you talk to people in the community or talk to people in Parliament, they don't really know actually what we're good at. So we kind of got McKinsey's report for us to answer this question. And it said the thing we've been best at in tech in Australia is enterprise software, SaaS, which is probably not going to be a surprise to anyone on this call, but it's the area where we've probably had the best track record of producing companies. And if you measure by funding raised or valuations or number of startups, like it comes out ahead. Really interestingly, pay tech was a really up and coming sector, not least because of the kind of companies that we're seeing like Zepto and obviously off the back of the success of Afterpay. So that diversified fintech more broadly, but particularly pay tech is a really strong strength of the Australian sector. And then the other areas that perform really strongly were things like biotech and medical devices, and also to a degree media and design. But some of that was more because there were really, really big successful companies in those areas, as opposed to perhaps the same level of depth that we're starting to see in areas like enterprise software and pay tech. So that was kind of what we were good at. But what was really interesting is we also asked them, where are you seeing the growth coming? And it was interesting to me that while obviously you kind of expect us to keep growing in those areas where we're already strong, it was things like mining tech, ag tech, ed tech, gaming, like parts of our economy more broadly that tend to be strengths of our sector. Diversified fintech, I should say, was another part of that. So when we're sort of combining tech with those other broader economic strengths, that was where some of this new kind of growth and innovation is coming from, which I find pretty exciting. And then we looked at like, where is the world laying a bet on Australian tech? So which sectors are we winning a bigger share of global VC capital in? And that was kind of interesting because that was basically energy tech and quantum were the two where the world was making some investments. So that was like interesting for us to kind of sense check what I think everyone sort of knows intuitively when you work in the sector, but they certainly came out as the real strengths. And I think the other kind of thing that's going to be interesting to watch over the next couple of years is what we see outside of our sector, outside of the direct tech sector, like how we see other companies starting to adopt tech. Like there's obviously huge opportunities to adopt more payments tech. There's huge opportunities to adopt AI and, even cloud still. I think cybersecurity, we're seeing like a huge uptick in investment in that by corporates off the back of some of those major incidents last year. So I think that will be another broader trend shaping our sector.
Great, thank you. And I should have said, sorry, I did a terrible job up front, but I should have said that you feel free to ask questions in the chat team and we will triage those through to the speakers. Damian, Kate mentioned there that the perception in Parliament of what Aussie tech really wasn't there, and that was part of the catalyst for doing that research. You were at the helm of Afterpay and played a pretty critical role in launching into the US with that company. What do you think? What do you think about how Australia is viewed as a market from other global markets? And do you think there's been a shift in how we've been viewed on the global stage?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and thanks to Zepto for hosting this. We think that these kind of conversations are really important. And I should just, off the back of Kate's comments, say that as a sector that I've been involved in for over a decade now, we knew a few years back that there wasn't an appropriate voice for the sector, and Kate has done an amazing job of kind of not only building it out but making it kind of more prominent and having more depth than I think anyone in the sector ever expected to have when the idea of some kind of body was first conceived a few years ago. Look, to answer your question, when I worked in the Prime Minister's office as digital economy advisor, it was really the nascent stages of the tech sector on Australia. We're talking around 2010 here, where the digital economy was, okay, let's create a NBN so we can have a functioning internet in this country. And really, it was the very early stages of Atlassian. And I remember a forum at the University of New South Wales with Scott Farquhar at the time. And it was at that stage Atlassian as the first real baby of the tech sector emerging. Because what Australia has been for most of the early stages of the last decade is just an outpost for US companies. And the discussion was, okay, how do we get Google to have more engineers here? Or how do we make sure Microsoft doesn't just see Australia as a sales office, or Apple just to see Australia as a sales office? Now, that was the discussion. We want the high-tech jobs here as well. I think the big shift really has been is that Atlassian, Canva, Afterpay, and now others are coming to maturity. And you can see that Zepto's in that early stages of it as well, where it's well established in Australia and thinking about how this really interesting innovation can be taken overseas. So Australia's kind of moved from an Australian outpost to a place where actually there's a lot of high skills and a lot of talent to actually, okay, companies can emanate from here and have a global footprint. So that's kind of been the trajectory. And I think that means the ecosystem here is far different to what it was 10 years ago, and a really interesting place now for someone to start a business and know it can go global from here, because the infrastructure is now in place with VCs, with talent, etc. The one thing that probably continues to be needed, and we continue to need to attract, is what I would call global leadership that can be based out of Australia. Look, traditionally, we have the skills, and something that at Afterpay we used to say a lot was, we have the skills, we don't necessarily have the global experience. So people from overseas who have run global tech companies coming here to help businesses expand is going to be very useful and important. To touch on that last point, yeah, look, Afterpay was the first consumer-facing tech product to launch in the US and succeed, and to have tens of millions of Americans adopt a consumer-facing Australian technology, I think was novel. It was interesting. It was really the first time regulators in that space, especially the fintech space, were seeing Australians kind of talk to them and kind of seeing how we thought about regulation, how we thought about engagement, which was actually quite different, because the American way is that there's actually a bit of hostility between the private sector and government, that actually regulators are seen as punitive forces within the ecosystem, things that you try and stay away from. Whereas Australia, I think the model has been much more of, how do we negotiate a new kind of way of regulating a new industry. But I think the fact that Atlassian is now based in San Francisco, has a big base in San Francisco, is listed on stock exchange in the US, kind of means that the US is becoming more familiar with the idea that, yes, you can have a global Australian company that has its leaders in Australia, but has a big presence in San Francisco and is listed on one of the US exchanges.
Great, thanks, Damian. I'm going to turn to Dom now. And Up, the bank that you founded, like Zepto, was born out of a real desire to solve a true problem in the Australian payments ecosystem. Let's look specifically at payments, because that's what we're pretty passionate about. And there's obviously a lot happening both across regulation and innovation. But when you look at the entire ecosystem, where do you think there's going to be the greatest kind of innovation and growth in the future when it comes to payments technology specifically?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I think the big shift that we've seen in the last decade. So I also founded Pym Payments, co-founded, and as a payments company, we exited a couple of years ago to Checkout. But what I see is that in the payment space, it's actually very similar to the banking space. There's two things that jump out to me. One is the ability for infrastructure to run in real time, and the consumer and business expectation that fintechs are now delivering a solution that is always on. So no longer can we have scheduled outages, and no longer can we have big implementations that are waterfall and that sort of stuff. So I think the expectation from consumers has shifted a lot, and it's interesting to see that in the fintech space, even though it's a fairly large sector in Australia, certainly we've seen those expectations for real time and always on coming from other sectors like social media. So people don't compare their fintech experiences to other fintech experience or banking experiences. They're really comparing them to what they can get in other parts of their life. So if Twitter and Google and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, if they can all be scaling to billions of users and be really fast and real time and instant, why can't the banks or why can't payment services? So I think that to me has been an area where we talk a lot about it, and we think that because the NBN and the NPP were implemented, that we're done. We're right at the beginning. It's only just the very early stages of that expectation becoming so pervasive that businesses that can't operate in real time and that can't stay on all the time will just disappear. So I think that's sort of one area that I would say is where we're going to see a lot more innovation. And then the other one, and we are seeing things like Pay2 and this sort of stuff, but it's very slow moving because the big incumbents are actually quite slow to adopt these new technologies. So companies like Zepto and other peers in the payment space are able to sort of push that agenda and make sure we get adoption more broadly. So I think that's pretty important. But the other one I wanted to mention, I think it's not worth leaving out, is that consumers, particularly, we see it a lot in banking, are becoming more socially aware. So I think community and environment, don't sound like they immediately have anything to do with tech, but really the way that technology can collaborate with agriculture or education or finance or any industry, it's having a bigger part to play in community engagement, social responsibility, the environment. This is an area where the next generation of Australians and people all over the world really want their technology, their startup businesses to be consciously thinking about that, in addition to be always available, always on, and real time. And so I think that social responsibility component and looking out for your social impact and your environmental impact is going to be just as important as the technology that you deploy.
Absolutely, and just as important to attract the great talent, I think, too, because I think in a market where there's skill shortages, increasingly people are looking for employers that are more socially responsible, and that value piece is really important. Great, thanks, Dom. I'm going to go back to Damian now, because I think Australia is really, you mentioned Atlassian, Canva's another one where Australia has been a breeding ground for some great tech unicorns, and the Tech Council actually did some great research in this space as well last year. But how do you explain such success, I suppose, to and what do you see if there's any threats to that continued success of Australia's tech companies?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we have touched on some of the reasons why the success is there. Look, I mean, the education is here, the skill sets are here, the drive to kind of innovate is here, and I think that the fact that we've seen some success stories means that others know that this can now be done. When I think about threats or the things that I've seen in the workplace, one seems to be this problem that we have in relation to cost of living and housing. And I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but part of the reason that tech employees can be and have been so successful is that there is a kind of concept of sharing the wealth in a way that doesn't doesn't exist with traditional industry. That at Google, even the receptionist, even though it was a small amount, participated in the restricted stock units program. That tech companies do have a culture, and a lot of policy development went into this to incentivize tech companies to offer equity to employees so everyone was in it. And it meant that if the company grew and did the thing that it was aiming to do, that this was not just something that the shareholders or the VCs or the founders benefited from, but everyone that was actually working from the business that took a risk at the early stage, especially if that income is going to be less. But that has meant that it has been a struggle for a lot of early stage tech companies to attract people if they're thinking about how much their mortgage is and how much they're spending on their house. Look, the other threat that I see in our ecosystem, which is a little bit different to the US, is this kind of concept that it's a success to be bought out by a big bank or a big company that's Australian based. And it is hard to imagine that Ford or BMW would be making so much innovation in relation to their electric car fleet if it wasn't for Telstra coming in and kind of really Tesla coming in and really smashing up the system in relation to how these operated. So I think it is a bit of a worry that, and we saw it with Afterpay as well. Are we going to be bought out? Are the banks going to come in and kind of take this over? And can they really be the arbiters of genuine innovation in the market? That is a particularly Australian cultural thing that seems to happen time and time again that we don't see overseas.
Kate, do you have anything to add on that one? I'm just conscious there's a couple of things there that the Tech Council might have a point of view on.
I think it's a really interesting time for Australian tech because, as Damian said, if you looked about 10 years ago, our sector looked really different. Like if you look at the number of unicorns we produce, for example, we have 2.3% of the world's unicorn companies now, even though we have about 1.6% of global GDP. But
Great, thanks. And that actually leads nicely into a question I had for Dom about investment. And, obviously, to your point, Kate, the market's tightened a little bit. But where do you think we're still seeing investment being made at the moment, Dom?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also sit on the board at Fintech Australia, so I see a lot of fintechs beyond just the ones that we invest in. But through the family office, we're very active. I think we made nearly 100 investments last year. So the market's very alive. But we're not seeing, people talk about dry powder. We're not seeing as many big venture capital deals as we might have seen because of the economic slowdown. And so getting capital is a little bit harder, and people are being more specific about what it is they're investing in. So I'd say specifically in the fintech space, payments is pretty hot. But I would say more broadly in the startup community outside of fintech, but also, in parallel, is the startup infrastructure space. So what we're seeing a lot of is what I call the operating system for startups, like everything that you need to run a startup. And you can think of companies like Stripe as an example. That when the Collison brothers started Stripe, it was a small team and they had a vision, they had an idea, but their customers were Uber and Airbnb. And so as those businesses grew, then obviously as a fintech, Stripe grew. And I think that model is something that we'll see more over the next decade. And so with that in mind, a lot of the businesses that we invest in, whether they be for capital infrastructure or whether they be for technology infrastructure or whether they be customer support infrastructure, but a lot of the businesses that we're investing in at the moment are those businesses that are not only potentially unicorns in their own right, but they actually can help build an environment or community of unicorns. And I think that is an area where Australia plays pretty well. And we don't have an enormous amount of examples of doing that, but I think that we have the talent, the expertise to be able to do that. And we end up helping a lot of international businesses do it rather than sort of homegrown. So I'm reasonably bullish on the infrastructure market. And like I said, I call that sort of the operating system for startups. And I think if we can sort of establish our position in that place, and then we can power other startups both here and in Australia, here and overseas, then I think we'll be able to dominate the next decade. And we already do, by the way. I know Kate mentioned some of the stats around unicorns, but per capita in Australia, we actually punch so far above our weight that we're number one in the world for producing unicorns. So when you do create a startup, you might start in your mum's garage or whatever, but you do have an opportunity to build a really significant business. And I think infrastructure is a really interesting play.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you're talking about that, Dom. I started, thinking about even us as Zepto and all the platforms that we use to enable our business operations, and how, potentially, to your point, as we grow and scale, they may grow and scale with us, and it's quite a great ecosystem as well. Kate, last week or so, the federal budget has been hounded down by government, and Damian, you might have a point of view on this as well. Kind of reactions from the tech sector and your members from what you're seeing, and if you think that will enable any particular type of growth in the future.
Yeah, great question. And I think Dom's point's really interesting. And I was thinking, as you're saying, Dom, like when you think that, like payments and fintech and enterprise software have been two of the strengths in the past, like they're probably two of the areas that are really beneficial to building infrastructure as well. So it's, I think it's a really, really thoughtful observation about that being a next growth area. I think the reaction to the budget from the tech sector was, look, I think the tech sector did better than most other industry sectors, and particularly if you include within that the broader clean energy sector. And the reasons for that are there were a couple of really important investments in there. So one was the government committed to migration reform, and including as part of that, they're going to have a specialist track for sort of high skills, so a specialist fast track for high skill talent in areas like tech and engineering. So that's a real win for the sector coming out of that migration review. And we certainly hear still from our members that finding some of that experienced talent or that global talent can be a pain point. Second thing I think the sector was pleased about, or we were pleased to see, was the government made a commitment to an industry growth fund, which is like roughly $400 million. And that's basically going to come into play ahead of the establishment of the National Reconstruction Fund. So that's that $15 billion co-investment fund model. And the purpose of that industry growth fund is basically to be able to allocate $50,000 to $5 million grants to promising companies in some of those high priority streams ahead of the NRF, and basically build up that pipeline of companies. And probably particularly for some of those capital intensive companies, for example, or ones that are a little bit further off commercialization, it's intended to sort of help them get through to that next stage gate. So we welcomed that investment. And then the third thing in there that we thought was beneficial for the sector, beneficial for the economy more broadly, but we benefit as a sector, was the government is committed to establish a national office for a cybersecurity coordinator. And I think we're all seeing that there's a rising incidence of cyber attacks, but probably the lessons I think everyone pretty universally acknowledges from what happened last year with Optus in particular, and then Medibank to an extent, was that there wasn't a great model in place for industry and government to collaborate in the wake of a major attack, and to sort of really make sure that there could be collaboration to investigate the incident, to make sure that any consumers impacted who might have lost ID documents and things like that could be speedily and clearly helped. And there wasn't, always a good way of triaging the requests that were coming in from state and government agencies for the companies impacted. So that we sort of welcome the establishment of that office, because we think that can help with that. And I think we're all going to be facing a reality of more, not less, cyber threats. So those three things were positives. And I think while I say I think the tech sector fared better than many other sectors, is there wasn't perhaps cuts or new tax rises, which is something that sort of other sectors saw. I think what was sort of missing from it, so what we'd really love to see for next year's budget was, and kind of to Damian's earlier point, we didn't sort of see any major new initiatives to spur investment or spur productivity. And I think that's going to be, it's a really big challenge for the economy. We've got, productivity 60-year low, risk of recession, lack of economic dynamism. So we really think not just investing government funding in kind of some new growth areas, but really spurring that broader tech adoption across the economy, which is ultimately good for our sector because they're customers of tech. That's sort of the missing piece, and but hopefully one the next budget can address.
Thanks, Kate. We're right on 2:00, and we promised everyone a quick kind of bite-sized piece of information, but I am going to close with a rapid-fire question for each of our panelists to ask. And while we do that, if someone does have a question, feel free to pop it in. Otherwise, I'll just keep firing along. So we touched on a few and named a few kind of Aussie tech unicorns during our discussion today. I'd love each of you, I know this is pretty hard, but what's your pick of an Aussie tech company to watch that might be our next unicorn to join the others? Damian, I'm going to throw to you first. Oh no, Dom's come off. Dom, go.
I was going to say we can't pick Zepto, right?
No.
No, the one I was going to say was BuildKite. BuildKite's an infrastructure business along the lines of what I was talking about, and it's powering thousands of other businesses, not just in Australia but all over the world. I think their ARR, their recurring revenue annually is around about 30 million, and they're looking forward. They've got line of sight to 100 million. So I think BuildKite, which is actually a small company that spun out of Pin Payments, and their first customer ever was Ferocia, the company that built up. So I'm very close to the BuildKite team, and we are investors there, but so are all the big venture capitalists. And I think that they will be a unicorn before we can blink.
Great hot tip there from Dom. What about you, Damian?
Yeah, a different space, and Kate mentioned earlier kind of some of the emerging climate tech companies that are emanating out of Australia, and the fact that so much of the lithium for batteries now is coming from Australian mining. There's a correlation with a really interesting company called Sakona, which is working on kind of silicon-based additives to lithium to make a battery last far longer than it does at the moment. It would kind of really be a significant game changer in relation to electric vehicles, batteries for your home, etc. They're Wollongong based, and very interesting, very exciting, and something that is really only happening in Australia.
I feel like I'm going to have to go look at these businesses after this call. I feel like, Kate, I'm asking you to pick your favourite child because obviously at the Tech Council, you represent a lot of startups and people in the tech industry. So I do feel like I'm asking you to pick your favourite child. But
I think you are too, Em. I feel like it's a really unfair question. So I'm deliberately not going to pick one of my member companies because that would just absolutely be like playing favorites. And as I always tell my daughter, I don't have one favorite child, although I may have one favorite daughter because I have a son as well. So I'm going to pick a non-member company just to be a diplomat, but like a company that I think is super interesting is Nourish, which is based in Canberra. So they came out of Syro, and they're doing plant-based oils, basically, which mimic the taste of meat and the aroma of meat, right? And the idea of this is there's obviously been a growth in plant-based protein. But like one of the barriers to people using them is that there's a tasting experience equivalent to meat, but in the technicals that you use play a really big part in the sensation. So, and I think just given the growth of that market, the fact that the people founding it have been some of the pioneers in producing really innovative food products historically, and it feels to me like a really transportable product because it's like quite light, and so all those issues that come with the distance of Australia, and I think that's, and just because we do have that pedigree in food exporting as well, I think I'm super excited about that. Maybe also because I'm vegetarian, and if I go visit them, I get a snack. But I think it's a really interesting food to watch.
You broke up a little bit there, Kate, when you were speaking. Can you just say the name of the company again to make sure everyone got that?
Sorry, Nourish. Based in Canberra.
I was about to say, I think you served some of their food at an event recently in Canberra, and it was the talk of the town when I saw people afterwards, and they were amazed at how nice it tastes. So yes, it's definitely a buzz.
That was Val. That was another example. So that was Val, which is manufacturing meat in a lab, which it's exactly the same kind of segment. Super interesting.
Well, I just wanted to add that not a specific company, but one of the things that we do is we invest in underrepresented founders. And so we try to back female founders, and we also try to work with First Nations or other people that don't have the same access to capital. So the thing I'm actually excited about is not a specific company per se, although we've all mentioned one. What I'm excited about is the type of founders that will be able to build unicorns in the next decade, because we are seeing many more diverse founders than we've seen in the past. And we're seeing opportunities open up for First Nations people or people on the gender spectrum, or people that wouldn't typically be 40-year-old blokes with a beard sort of thing. So I think that I just wanted to call that out, that in the next decade it won't be necessarily a company in particular, but it's actually every company that is run by a woman, for example, is delivering better returns than the businesses that are traditionally sort of coming out of Silicon Valley run by a man. So I just think that's worth saying, because it's certainly an area that we try to invest in as well.
I think that's a lovely, positive, optimistic note to finish on, Dom, because I think it is really exciting. I think also being Byron Bay headquartered, we're seeing some startups coming out of regional areas as well, which is really inspiring because they used to be quite concentrated in the big cities. So I think really exciting time ahead with some diverse businesses to come out of the ecosystem. Really want to thank each of you for your time and your insights. I really enjoyed the discussion and could have gone for a lot longer, but I better wrap it up because I'm already over. Thank you also to everyone for joining us. There will be more of these webinars coming down the line. We have one in the next couple of weeks, so watch this space. But we're really excited to continue this series, and thank you all for joining us.
Likewise, awesome. Glad to be part of it.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.